Hi, Ruth. Welcome to this side of the internet. It's good to have you here.
Hi, Juanita. It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me for this conversation.
And thank you for making that time as well. So this is the second episode of our Feminist Digital Digest series. And in this series, we host conversations with African feminists working at the intersection of digitalization, platformization, and the future of workers. And for those who haven't yet, please watch the intro session. And in today's session, we will be exploring how digitalization and the technology industry are tied to structural power inequalities, particularly neoliberal capitalism, colonialism, imperialism, and among many others. And as a friend of mine, Leah Renyu likes to say, there's nothing new under the capitalist sun. And so we'll be looking at the extent to which digital platforms have challenged and reconfigured existing modes of capital accumulation. And we'll also interrogate platformization's impact on wealth inequalities and how all this has impacted labor market relations. With me today is Dr. Ruth Castel. Um, I met Ruth recently at the Feminist Africa conference, although I'd like to confess that I had already been stalking you online. So it was a pleasure connecting with you in person. I am a great fan of your research and I look forward to exploring this world with you. So tell us a bit more about yourself. Who is Ruth? What does she like to do? What are your interests? What encourages you to get out of bed in the morning?
Podcasts like these get me out of bed in the morning.
Yeah, that's nice.
Um, no, so I started my sort of interest in questions of capital really from the vantage point of workers. And initially working with precarious workers across all different sectors. This was before the kind of platform economy blew up as we see it.
Mm,
And so I used to work a lot with construction workers, domestic workers in Mozambique, where I was born, also agricultural workers, and began to think about questions of unemployment. And eventually I moved from the labor organizing space to the policy space, and then eventually to the academic space. So I really see
mm,
myself as a kind of interdisciplinary,
yeah.
interprofessional researcher. But I think the common thread has always been trying to figure out where are the sources of exploitation and how, what are potential strategies to claw back power from capital, claw back value from capital.
Mm,
Other than that, when I'm not thinking about that, I like to garden. I have a hallway in where I
mm.
have plants.
That's so
Um,
interesting.
yeah, I like to go for walks and I like to cook. Just some of the things.
Oh.
Mm.
It's interesting that you say that both my parents have green thumbs, and it seems like it skipped me. I've killed I've killed quite a number of plants, unfortunately. But yeah, so it's good to see that you're to gardening and walking. I do love walking myself. I used to like cooking. I'm not so sure about that now, but yeah, I like food.
Yes,
And I'm
exactly.
glad and I'm glad I feel that you're the perfect person to be to for us to host for this session. So we'll get into the thick of things. And really today, like I mentioned before, we are trying to connect digitalization and capitalism. So we'll start off by trying to link these two. So how is digitalization shaped by capitalism, and how is digitalization shaping capitalism? I've had concepts such such as digital capitalism. So is there any... Did you hear me?
Thanks. There was a slow moment there online,
Oh,
but I think
no.
I heard the question. There was a cutout. I think it might have
Okay.
been thanks. I think that's quite it's a tough question, but maybe the way to start is to think about who are the richest people in the world today. And if we go on these websites that list your big billionaires, your Forbes, websites, for instance, you'll see that the richest people in the world today are primarily connected to the tech industry in some way. And most of them are based in the United States. So although in some ways the tech world has the semblance of a kind of global footprint, both the sites of investment and the nodes of accumulation continue to be in the global north. And I think what we've seen with the rise of tech, with the rise of big tech, is the concentration of capital across sectors and geographies. You can have an Uber that says it's a tech intermediary that's mediating transportation services all over the world, from motorcycle delivery of food to car taxi services. In some countries, they're getting into the boat industry, but they don't identify by sector. Instead, they say they are tech intermediaries. And so I think as we see this concentration of capital across sectors and geographies, what we also see is the consolidation of power, of political power, among big tech firms. And perhaps the most obvious example of that is Elon Musk in the United States, who has put his full weight behind the right wing, kind of populist wing of the US, and has quite purposefully, intentionally bought up some of the big communication platforms, X, right, Twitter, in order to be able to kind of control communications as it emerges in this tech world. And there's so many consequences. It's hard to there's so many. It's almost like a many-headed hydra, or octopus. In terms of what the implications of that are, I think some of the implications that we've seen that we can speak a little bit more about, what are increased techniques of surveillance that have been pivoted in warfare, as we've seen in Palestine. Israel using AI to subject Palestinians to inordinate violence, death, destruction. Growing labor insecurity, as we see, for instance, on digital labor platforms that we'll speak about a little bit later, and the kind of economic precarity that creates, a kind of promotion of a culture of consumption as an alternative to demands of redistribution, which in many ways are sustained through the financialization and increased indebtedness of people, the extraction of value from consumers. The idea was that it was workers at production sites that used to be the source of extraction of surplus value, but now we as consumers producing data that is repackaged and sold to places that we can't even imagine. We ourselves have become producers of value in our very consumption. And governments have struggled both to regulate these footloose companies, but also to tax them. So you're also seeing situations in which states are increasingly unable, actually, to claw back that value that's being produced. And that has implications for austerity, for public provisioning, and so on. There have been attempts to break some of these monopolies on the basis that they also stifle any other kind of innovation happening among small and medium enterprises and so on. But ultimately, I think what we're seeing is a kind of consolidation of what some have called tech authoritarianism, in which these companies are entirely unaccountable to people and have inordinate power. And we also see a backlash in that process against women, and the kind of against the feminist gains that were made, and the kind of mobilization of right-wing populism online. But it's not a sort of grassroots right-wing populism. It's one that's very much driven and facilitated by this big tech capital. And obviously this has, and we can talk about that later, but there's sort of imperial and colonialist dynamics to how this operates. So a gloomy picture I've just painted.
Yeah, it's really a gloomy picture that you have painted. And you have laid out right from the start the exploitative nature within which these big tech companies work. I mean, we already see a global economic order that is highly, highly unequal. And so they are coming in and just exploiting on that and building onto that which is already unequal. So a lot, I mean, even Elon Musk, a lot of people will argue and say, I mean, it's innovation, it's entrepreneurship, it's growing the economy. So is big tech really, is it really a bad thing? Why should we pay a lot of attention to it? And how did a few I'm assuming there are few digital companies become so powerful. I know you have talked about linking it to imperialism and neoliberalism. So how is it that they've been able to gain so much power and so much influence in our day-to-day lives, but also in, for example, Africa's economies? How have they been able to do that?
Yeah, so oftentimes when we refer to the big tech, we're really speaking about the largest multinational corporations that are operating in the IT sector. Many of them, if we look at their history, did start as tech startups. Some of them before, as part of the dot-com boom, many after the first dot-com boom busted. And many expanded since the financial crisis. And I think that there's certainly an element of tech innovation that has been important in propelling the sector, from the internet to the expansion of cheap mobile technology to cloud computing. I mean, without this kind of tech infrastructure, it would have been impossible for many of these companies to thrive. But it's not a coincidence that they also emerged in the way they did on the heels of deregulation, sort of the facilitation of movement of capital across the globe, the process of globalization, financialization, venture capitalists that were investing in many of these companies in order for them to expand. And a lot of that process took place in the global north, and particularly around specific nodes. So Silicon Valley and Wall Street are intricately tied. And I think that this kind of gets to the question of the imperialist or colonialist dynamics that emerge. Because much as if we think about the industrial capital of the UK, was able to derive investment from the merchant capital that had benefited from the slave trade in order to advance the Industrial Revolution. Many of these firms have been able to derive or mobilize capital that emerged from earlier rounds of industrialization in order to funnel into this kind of tech process. So it's not to say that it's path dependent and that the same people stay rich across century. You can see movement in that. But what you see is that the initial expropriation of the history, of colonialism and slavery has continued to sort of manifest itself in terms of the spaces for investment and expansion. And for much of the capital, the tech capital, the global South in general becomes sort of a new frontier of accumulation, right? They're footloose companies and they can expand and draw profit both from the extraction of natural resources, of cheap labor, as we've seen, where people are being hired, and we'll talk about that later, but on the African continent on wages that are just not equivalent, and through data and the sucking up of data from all over the world, which is then repackaged for purposes that we aren't even necessarily aware of. And so this reproduces the kind of imperial dynamics that we have seen. Now, many of our governments across the African continent, and you see this in the African Union papers, you see this in the regional papers, you see this in national development plans, hope that digitalization will essentially allow for the creation, will allow the African continent to reposition itself in the global division of labor. The sense that maybe we missed out in the dot-com boom. We weren't able to develop call centers in that period. We were stuck in structural adjustments. But now this is our moment to kind of pivot and try to advance some kind of service-driven structural transformation that will in fact allow for the diversification of our economies and higher productivity, value addition, the sort of metrics that we see as key to ensuring improved well-being, jobs, development, and so on. But some of the research that's now emerging by scholars like Mohamed Amir Anwar and others suggests that the terms of incorporation into this global digital economy have been adverse. And that in fact, in many cases, what we see is that the terms have entrenched Africa's subordinate position within the global economy, rather than allowed for a kind of leapfrogging into the future. But of course, that's based on looking at specific sectors like digital labor platforms. And I think I will say, lest us just only have doom and gloom, that this is not a sort of anti-technology or anti-innovation discussion. It's rather one about, well, okay, what are the terms of incorporation, and the need for us to be much more hard-nosed about that.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. It's not an anti-technology conversation, but I think that it's important to acknowledge the playing field and how, for example, African countries are entering into this playing field. Is it a leveled playing field? A lot of our countries, I think all our governments are pushing for innovation. For example, in Uganda, our president does not care about the arts anymore and is pushing for things like sciences. People have to study sciences. Those are what are being funded. But even what we are studying is something that is borrowed knowledge, is something that might not be contextually specific for us or relevant for us. So we need to understand how it is that we are essentially entering this playing field. What geopolitical issues should we look out for, and things like that. And you've spoken about digital platforms and labor and wages, and I think the work that we are doing within this framework is specifically on the online gig economy and how this is changing labor dynamics as we know it. How, I mean, I'm working from home. You and I are speaking over a Zoom platform. So how these are just changing the world of work. So in all that you've shared, all that you have shared so far, how are these dynamics, how have they impacted labor market relations? Specifically, what have been the impacts of these digital labor platforms on the regeneration of intersectional inequalities? I mean, if we are speaking about persons living with disabilities, if we are speaking about women, if we are speaking about people who are already living at the margins, how is this impacting labor market relations, but also reproducing intersectional inequalities if they are?
Yeah, I mean, the platform economy is so vast. And we started doing research on platform work about 5 years ago. And the landscape has really changed, in part, I think, catalyzed by the COVID pandemic and the need to have ways of communicating and exchanging without being physically in the same place, and so it's really a rapidly developing area. And if we look at the kind of landscape of what are the types of digital platforms, we see that there's social media, and there's the rise of social media influencers, and there's a whole economy around that, and many people trying to make a business out of that. My brother, for instance, has a business on Instagram where he sells clothes, and that business is connected to the business of influencers, which is connected to this other business on how you get rich fast, right? There's this illusion that you can be a sort of self-employed person and create a career or create wealth in a context of limited opportunities through social media. Then there's the e-commerce sites, and in some way they overlap. But often this is where you've seen a large concentration in the retail sector. So you have your Amazons, or in South Africa, where I am now, we have Take-A-Lot and these companies that then have smaller buyers that kind of touch into them. And then we have the digital labor platforms, which mediate the exchange of labor, the allocation and exchange of labor, usually between a worker, maybe an intermediary, and then some kind of consumer in the process. And in many ways, this isn't very different from the traditional middlemen that used to exist, except that they've become sort of digital tech intermediaries that are mediating across multiple sectors. And within the digital labor platforms, you kind of have two groups. You have what they call the online-based platforms. These are often mediating things like translation services, editing, legal documents, and they're employing what are the middle classes, the skilled, highly qualified middle classes that have not been able to find jobs. I mean, in places like South Africa today, part of the debate is no longer just about expanding the education system, but it's about what happens when you have a large number of unemployed graduates, right? And then the online-based platforms are put forward as an answer to that. And then on the other side, you have location-based platforms, which in some ways have more structural power than online-based platforms because they're based in a place. And they tend to employ overwhelmingly men involved in delivery services and taxi services and other kinds of online-based activities, but also increasingly women in those sectors, as well as new sectors that are expanding, like domestic work. We have a platform in South Africa called Sweep South that I think has also expanded to Kenya. That is, again, it's a sort of digitization of what used to be maybe agency or intermediary work that was done before. So there's a large variety, but there are some commonalities. One of them is the digital mediation, which offers some jobs the semblance of respectability. You don't want to be, to go back to the example of my brother, rather than selling clothes outside somewhere, right, in what might be a slightly informal arrangement, he can sell them online within the comfort of his own home. So this idea that, there's something respectable and clean and safe about this kind of digital mediation in some, depending on the sector again. But the second aspect is that often the people that are there as workers, and I'm using the term worker loosely, are classified as self-employed. And in some instances, they really are, in that they kind of meet the criteria. So they, control their time, they control the labor process, they benefit from the profit, etc. But in many, many instances, they're not. And I think the most extreme examples are your Uber delivery drivers, your other location-based platforms, where actually you're subjected to high levels of algorithmic management. This allure of being your own boss really doesn't go very far because you're being surveilled and controlled through ratings and forced to work through all sorts of forms of coercion that are digitally defined. The other aspect that I think is important to keep in mind is that because people are identified as self-employed, they have to absorb the full operational risk. And they don't have the right to any of the labor or social protection rights that a worker would ordinarily. And so if you look again at your Uber taxi drivers and so on, they have to pay for the car, they have to pay for the maintenance, the petrol, and so on. And that means that a lot of workers become heavily indebted and they become vested in the activity, both as worker, they're trying, to feed themselves and their families, but also in a sort of weird double identity as an employer, in that they have they can't abandon that job because they're indebted, because they have a car that they have to pay off and so on and so on. So that traps people in these processes in a way that one isn't necessarily trapped in a direct employment relationship. And of course, the work is highly individualized, which means that it's very difficult to actually have any kind of collective action. And so these are some of the challenges that are posed. There's the promise of what it can offer, particularly in countries with high levels of informality, with high levels of unemployment. But the conditions overwhelmingly are low wages, long working hours, no access to any kind of occupational health and safety protections, so no access to social security or maternity benefits or any of those hard-fought rights. And of course, when we then begin to look at gender, we begin to look at class, or we begin to look at race, depending on the context, depending on the platforms that we're looking at, you also see that there's all sorts of inequalities that are reproduced. So for instance, we did a survey recently in Kenya, and we saw with drivers, and we saw that women actually, contrary to expectations, drive much longer hours than men, despite the fact that they also have a higher reproductive burden. And one of the reasons for that is that they're driving in hours that are considered off-peak, because driving in those hours is safer than driving in the peak hours. And also in the peak hours, they have other household responsibilities to tend to. And these various forms of inequality reproduce themselves in ways that affect people's material lives in very real and meaningful ways.
Oh, it's interesting that the last point you mentioned of women actually drive longer hours. I had actually thought it was the opposite. But so in all this that you've shared, that workers in quotes are self-employed, they do have to have their own capital to start whatever work that is. So is it still capitalism? Because then if the workers do not own, no, the workers own the means of production, is it? So you're bringing your own car. Essentially, what this the corporation is essentially connecting you to is bringing the technology that connects you to clients, right? But you own everything else. I mean, if you're a domestic worker, you have to go with your own tools of production. So is it still capitalism? Has it morphed into something else? Or is this something that we still have to navigate? Or really, is it just capitalism that has changed its skin? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, I think it's, as you say, it's capitalism that has changed its skin. The working arrangements that we see today are not very different from the working arrangements that have existed, throughout much of the world,
Mm.
and through much of history. My father always tells me a story about his mother. So they used to sterilize needles. They had like a at home to make extra money. They would sterilize needles for a middleman. So the middleman would come and drop off the things, and then my grandmother would sterilize these needles, and my father and his sister would help. And then someone else would come and pick them back up. Now they could say, "Oh, look, you're not on a factory floor. You're at home. You're doing it on your own time. You're being paid by the piece. You're self-employed. You have autonomy over the labor process." But of course, in that case, what made it possible to actually have access, to have this even be a source of income was the middleman and was all of the goods. The platform company says, well, that's no longer the case now because now you have the car. So like you're buying your own needles, but the platform itself has become part of the means of production, right? And the companies have proprietary control over that platform and over the data generated. And when we look at, for instance, alternatives that are emerging, there's some cooperatives, for instance, that have tried to create their own platforms to compete with these large platforms. They struggle because these multinational big tech platforms have been able to absorb so much data that their app is more efficient. They're able to more accurate, more effective at connecting people. They've taken up such a sizable part of the market that it also stifles other opportunities from emerging. And I think that's one of the critiques around innovation, going back to, the question that you raised. If small companies and startups are no longer able to thrive in that context because the market has been usurped by, a small group, a small number, then what does that actually effectively also mean for innovation? But back to your question, I would argue that for the most part, we've seen waves of this. And often what we see is that when workers organize and they're able to claim a demand from capital, that demand at some point becomes institutionalized. So workers organize and all of a sudden we have something called standard employment relations. Well, if we go back 100 years, standard employment relations were not standard. And so the digitalization has been used to kind of peel back at those hard-won victories. But the good news is if they were fought and won once, we can fight and win again. And there's this Beverly Silver, who's a labor scholar. She often says, when wherever capital flows, labor conflict soon follows. And today's precarious working classes may very well be tomorrow's established working classes. The question is struggle.
Yeah. And I think that really brings us it really brings us into like the next part of what I was going to say, because if you say that these corporations have monopolized data, have more monopoly than the other alternatives that are coming up, so can we still fight? Should we still fight? I know that because of the ways that labor relations are now, corporations have been trying to convince workers that not to fight for their labor rights, and essentially tell them, but you're not workers. So what could be the alternatives, if any? Is there something that even the consumers can do? For example, like personally, I'll say, okay, I want support, maybe like a big tech corporation, and maybe I support like local startups, but still the business model is the same. So yeah, so what can we do?
So thanks for the question. This reminds me of a piece that was said by Nanjala Nyabola at the Feminist Africa conference where we met face to face, in which she highlighted, the digital technologies have this disembodying effect, and that in some way human life can be transformed in sort of an aggregation of algorithms. So
Mm,
the opposite of disembodying is embodiment. And that critical to embodiment is highlighting this materiality that lies underneath what seems like the immaterial world, this algorithm. But behind the
mm,
algorithm, there's bodies, there's people, there's workers, there's laborers.
mm,
And so that we need to, in some ways, recenter bodies. And of course, in the process of recentering bodies, recognize that bodies are differentially valued, have been historically differentially valued um, on our continent by race, by gender, by disability or ability.
mm,
Um, but in recognizing that and recognizing the struggles around those issues, that gives us some avenues to think about how to claw back value from capital. Um,
mm,
and ultimately, the kind of process of embodiment is a struggle, right? And it's a struggle that's subject to backlash. Um, but what's also amazing is that even in the most precarious circumstances, workers are organizing. And part of it, I think, for us is to pay attention to where that's happening, how it's happening it, and to allow for some cross exchange of information and experimentation and consolidation of strategies. So for instance, if we look at the platform economy, we see that, some workers are organizing via WhatsApp, others are
mm.
associations, others are
They're
in
using the same technology.
they use it. I have a colleague who has now passed, but he used to say technology is a double-edged sword. That same technology that casualizes you is the one you're
Yeah.
then going to use, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, how is it that we look at where are these struggles happening? And, I've done a lot of work over time with different kinds of workers' organizations. Sometimes they're worker centers, sometimes they're unions. And I think my takeaway from that is that none of these structures are fixed. I mean, the unions uh, are in a moment of struggle, I think, globally. And there's many legitimate critiques that have come particularly from feminist movements, but not only from feminist movements, vis-a-vis the kind of historical culture of trade unionism around the world, which tended to be patriarchal, tended to be focused on formal sector workers. It tended to marginalize already marginalized workers from its ranks. But what's also true is that unions have continuously evolved over time.
Mm,
And there's some things they can do and as a model, not as an organization, but as a kind of model, which other organizations historically have struggled to. Collective bargaining, creating at their best democratic places of decision making, being able to go out on strike, right? They have some forms of institutional and associational power that other types of formations have struggled to have. So the question also for me that I find interesting is, where is there experimentation happening? And we see on our continent, actually, there's a lot of experimentation, partially because the informal sector has been so large and because unions took such a hit with structural adjustment that they started to organize. Domestic workers started coming into the unions. Informal traders started to come into the association. So it's not surprising that actually many places on the continent are at the forefront of the unions on the continent are at the forefront of beginning to experiment with bringing platform workers in. We've seen this in Nigeria. We've seen this in Kenya. And it hasn't been easy. We wrote an article, this building a car while driving it, but unions have, okay, how do you organize workers that are not covered by labor relations? And how are you going to get dues from workers when there's not a clear deduction and transfer mechanism to the union? And especially as women workers get absorbed into historically male sectors like transport, what does that mean for the kinds of demands and ways of working that unions need to assume? And I think there's a lot of work to be done. but it's not a place that's stagnant. And obviously, going along with that, you have to have regulation of corporations. But where you have regulation without the participation of workers, broadly defined, you end up with regulation that's very pro-business. And I think we really have to, there's no replacement for building power at a grassroots level by those who are like most affected. And to circle back to your question, then where do consumers fit into this? I think it's a really interesting question, because particularly when we look at questions, you know, the issue of data, for instance, the consumers are producing as much data for the platforms and for capital as workers are, right? And there's lots of potential spaces of alliance building. And I think this is one of the areas that has been grossly underexplored, and that ultimately will be necessary if we are to build really a sort of movement that can get meaningful concessions back from these platform companies.
Yeah, thanks for that. And it's interesting that you talked about policies and regulation, because in my mind, of course, one of the things, a lot of the strategies and alternatives in the space is people keep pushing for regulation, people keep pushing for policy formulation. But I think one of the bigger questions that I have been having in my mind is why has why why is good governance and policy regulation, why are they not compatible with these big monopolies? Because yes, you can have the laws, but still you'll still see the same companies you earlier talked about taxation, you'll still see the same companies. Uber and all its taxation issues here in Africa, you'll still find the same corporations in all those different spaces. So is regulation really I know it's not really the silver bullet, but why is it that it's incompatible with with these big corporations and these monopolies? Why hasn't it been able to push back and fight back? But also, I think in the same breath, is 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 a question around what greater responsibility and accountability should states take? Should our states take in this? Because it's one thing to push for tech and allow for investment and all these things, but what more can they do when it comes to being responsible and being accountable? If they are even able to, of course, understanding the unequal power relations.
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult question. But, I mean, I think on one level, the tech world globally moved so quickly that they
Yeah.
benefited from sort of being ahead of the game and slipping through the
Mhm.
cracks of the regulations that existed.
Mm.
Labor regulation just being one of them, you know. Tech companies now say, no, we're tech intermediaries, we're not employers, we don't operate by sector. Oh, okay. So we're not, we're not bound by labor regulation, but there's so many. So there were steps ahead. And I think that it's only now really that countries are starting to catch up. And it's interesting to see what states are starting to do. So one of the areas has been around competition and trying to break up monopolies. We've seen this in the US, and actually with courts starting to rule against big tech
Yeah.
companies in regards to monopolies. We've seen the same in South Africa. So in South Africa, the Competition Commission took a group of companies that are associated with Take-A-Lot, which is this big e-commerce platform. And there were hearings, in fact, about them. And the hearings were about the extent to which the concentration of retail in the small number was undermining the success of small and medium enterprises, many of which would have been historically disadvantaged enterprises in South Africa. In other words, in the South African context, which obviously is emerging from the apartheid period of gross wealth inequality, it becomes actually an issue around transformation, right? And racial transformation, and economic development, et cetera, and equity, and some of the promises of what was the of the anti-apartheid period, or the anti-apartheid promise. And so that was the way in which this question was couched in the South African context with the Competition Commission. But of course, e-commerce then comes up and says, no, now we've created a platform for small and medium companies to sell their goods. Actually, we're helping them. So that doesn't really get at the heart of the kind of the problem of where accumulation is taking place and how to redistribute that. I think the other place where we've seen some movement now has been around corporate taxation and discussions around global agreements around corporate taxation, in part because Europe has fallen so far behind on this latest tech innovation that they're concerned that they're unable to tax and that they've been kind of left out of the game. And there's a question about what that offers countries across the African continent in terms of, debates around, but this has been a debate around extractive economies and a range of sectors. It's not a new debate per se. And of course, the constraints that we have to do with the global architecture of trade, from the WTO to the global architecture of sort of the international financial institutions that were historically behind, or structural adjustment policies that continue to shape policy and place constraints, to the very real sense and needs of having to create opportunities for a growing youthful population. And that's meant that many governments have been reluctant to overregulate for fear of losing, right? The threat of these companies getting up and leaving gives them significant leverage. I think globally, we've also seen, and there was the case, for instance, of the Uber leaks, that from Europe to the US to the African continent, these companies, because they have so many resources, they've been able to also exert significant political influence, which has also undermined the regulation. But what's interesting is also the places where struggles have happened and things have moved a little bit. So if you look, for instance, the Kenyan case, where you have the National Transport and Safety Authority, there's a regulation now for the e-hailing sector. It's not a sort of what you would call the ideal regulation. It still kind of protects notions of self-employment and so on. But it was contested by Uber and Bolt on the basis that they were tech intermediaries and they shouldn't be regulated as transport companies, that they were registered elsewhere, so they weren't even subject to Kenyan regulation. And the Kenyan government rejected that and has been effectively able to regulate them. So I think that there's incremental victories, and it's very important that we learn from each other and try to move the needle, and experiment and see what works.
Yeah, and I really like the idea of experimentation. I think it's something that at now we really like to do, to experiment, to explore new worlds, and to also weave new worlds to see what could be different. And I know that this conversation could go on and on, because I do have a lot of questions myself. But like I said, we will continue exploring this work and exploring this world together with you, Ruth. And thank you for all the work that you have done, all the research that I think a lot of us are heavily relying on. And our conversation time has come to an end, but if you would like to share anything else, you feel free to share, but we can catch up in the next recording. Yeah,
Thanks.
so do you have anything to share?
No, I just to say thank you, and also to thank NAUI Collective for all of the amazing work that you do. I'm always checking out your publications, and you just have an incredible series of resources available for all of us. So thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you.